I'm an architect with Feilden, Clegg, Bradley. I live in Bath. We've got offices in Bath and London, Manchester and Belfast. And most of my work with the practice has been with existing buildings. So I joined having trained at Newcastle University, and then I developed this real interest in existing buildings. I became accredited as a conservation architect, but we're working with historic buildings and important buildings, but in the kind of contemporary design environment. So I just wanted to talk to you about three projects I've been involved in recently, two which are modern buildings, and then one sort of ancient building over in Bath, which is the Abbey. And I guess this thing is, I've sort of put ancient and modern there, and I just wanted to talk about some of the challenges and architectural challenges in some of those projects, and hopefully it will be interesting in some way or another, and I can stay on for a little bit afterwards to have a chat if anybody wants to, or receive complaints. Just let me know. So my interest in historic buildings went back to when I did my year out. I applied for 150 jobs in the recession around the 1990s when I left university. I got one job offer, and it was in a conservation practice, and I went to see what it was all about, thinking I'd hate it, and it was absolutely amazing. Had a great time for a year, understanding how people were spiritually engaged in working with historic buildings, and went back to university, got on with my fourth and fifth year, and then ended up joining Feilden, Clegg, Bradley. And then about 12 years ago, I had the chance to do what's called a Churchill Fellowship, which was a chance to go and look at something overseas of interest. You should check it out. It's called the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust Fund. And I had the chance to look at the conservation of modern architecture overseas in North America, India, and Europe. And I looked at the different philosophies of how people were dealing with the challenge of modern buildings. And so two of the projects I'd like to talk to about now are informed by some of those things. Last year in our office, this idea of making more of modernism, whether they're buildings by renowned modern architects or whether they're just 1960s buildings, was something that we wanted to have a think about, because it's a challenge that is going to face us all as architects for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And we put together an exhibition which kind of told the story of one of the projects we're working on at the moment, which is the South Bank Centre, which has just finished in the opening of the Hayward Gallery, and is about to open in the refurbishment of the Queen Elizabeth Hall. And so in our office, we just pulled together some of the artifacts and pieces that we'd collected just from this project. And it was kind of interesting just to connect with their sculptural beauty. These are just core samples, so where we've investigated the condition of the concrete in that building, drilled a core in and taken a slice out, a bit like a piece of cheese or something, and we brought them all back to the office, shared them with people, shared the models that we'd made to experiment with the roof lights, and had them as artifacts. And this is the project that we've been dealing with. I'm sure some of you may have been here. This is the back elevation facing Waterloo Station. This is a building that was built in 1967, so it's about 50 years old. And interestingly, it's not listed, although it has the Grade 1 listed Royal Festival Hall next door, and probably the Grade 1 listed National Theatre next door. But the Hayward Gallery and the South Bank Centre sit in the middle. Designed by the Greater London Council architects, a chap called Dennis Crompton was taking a lead, and we met him as part of the process. He's probably mid-70s now, but we wanted to talk with him about an approach to conservation and refurbishment. And it has this really iconic profile with these pyramidal roof lights, which were added to admit natural daylight into the art galleries of the Hayward, predominantly on the top floor there. And the roof lights never worked, which was one of the reasons for the project. Although they were an idea, they were designed hurriedly. They always leaked. They didn't work environmentally. They let water in, they let heat out. And that became a real problem for the gallery, particularly where you need to maintain these quite stringent conditions of temperature and humidity to accommodate some of the most important artwork in the world. So very soon after it was opened, a new ceiling was put in underneath, which had the lights and the air movement and addressed some of these problems that existed before. So when we started this project 2 years ago, and we turned the building off to do the work, the heating and the lighting had been on 24/7 for 47 years, maintaining these gallery conditions. So it's become hugely energy hungry with this redundant profile on the top. So we took down the ceiling and we asked ourselves what was an appropriate kind of conservation and architectural approach to repairing the roof, repairing these pyramid roof lights. Should we keep them? Should we throw them away? Should they become the roof light? And in the structure we found from the bottom up there, in black is the main kind of truss structure of the roof. You can see the pyramid roof light up at the top, and then all these layers of plywood and polystyrene and electrics that sat in between. And what we wanted to get to was this kind of thing. So a new functional ceiling, being able to let the light into these galleries, being able to black out the galleries, and in between still be able to have artificial lighting and air movement to keep them fresh and keep that relative humidity. And we worked with Max Fordham to work within this zone of the grid and then to create a ceiling system which was functional in between. And the way it was designed was as a kit of parts to try and make it as simple as possible. And we came up with the idea of the glass or really the functional part, if I just point on that one there. So really the functional part of the roof being down here, and if you can just see those tilted static roof lights, so they're all fixed and they're the weatherproof area. Then fitting within it these coffered structures that allow natural daylight to come in but avoiding direct sunlight to come way down to the bottom. Having trusses that sit in this grid and plumes or plenums that allow the air to come through. And then right on the top, just reinstating these pyramids as open-sided glass structures so that on one side they're fritted glass to again protect from solar gain, but on the other side they're open to allow the thing to cool down and for fresh air to circulate. So these things were craned in, you can see them coming in, and it enabled the whole of the building to be built and made weatherproof down here with a simple glass roof system, and then for these sculptural pyramidal hats to be added on top. So you can see on the left and the right, on the left the old structural system that was failing, and on the right this kind of emblematic new shield which does some of the job and restores and preserves the aesthetic. And these photographs were taken a couple of months ago as it was kind of restored, and we very much wanted to leave the rest of the concrete alone, where we didn't have to touch it. We didn't clean it, we left it as its kind of gutsy original 1960s interior, but adding some sparkle in the areas where we felt it would make the most difference. So it has its aesthetic back. It has an LED lighting installation, so it can change its colour. It can tell the time, in a sense, through the colours of the rainbow. Sits next to Waterloo Bridge, and it does its thing, but quite calmly, other than this new array. And then internally, it enables it to black out the space or to open up to offer full gallery control. And then within the gallery itself, this was video that was shot about 3 weeks ago. So it's just been reopened with a photographic exhibition. And again, the idea is just to provide that natural lighting, but which could be closed down. Now the second one is a much more ordinary building, and one that many of you might be familiar with. It's just down the road, well, down a few roads over in Clifton, which is the Richmond building, and which was the Students' Union for the University of Bristol. Again, it's a 1960s building. This was its coverage in, I think, the Architect's Journal at the time, or perhaps it was Building Design Magazine. Built in 1965, designed by the Alec-French Partnership, and we think this was probably the first purpose-built students' union in the country. Cost about £1 million at the time, now 50 years old, still there, still doing its job. This is what students looked like in 1967. This was a building that was built with a TV studio, a barber's shop. It has a big performance venue. I don't know if any of you have been to the Anson Rooms, which is in this building at Bristol University. Had a theatre, a swimming pool, all the things that it was felt students needed to live a life at home, away from home in the 60s, and have jolly good ideas in the student bar. And when we got involved about 5 years ago, it was a building like many 1960s institutional buildings, which had just kind of slipped into a confusing state. This is the Anson Rooms, which is the large stand-up performance venue at the bottom as it's appeared. People like David Bowie appeared here back in the 70s. But it's now, when we found it then, it was kind of very restricted, very closed down. You see top right, some of the low-level ceilings, polystyrene which had been put in, the signage had been overlaid, buildings had gradually become, the building and rooms had gradually become more claustrophobic. And outside of the building, again, it had developed a reputation as a problem building. I think the students didn't quite like the university who owned the building because they felt their building had been underinvested in. I think the students didn't quite like the neighbours because the neighbours complained all the time about the students and their loud antisocial concerts and what happened when the bar opened. The neighbours complained about the university because they didn't have access to the swimming pool, despite it being in their neighbourhood. And yet the university was stuck with this piece of real estate which they wouldn't get permission to build again at that scale in the middle of a conservation area, and it was worried about its rising heat bills and so on. So at the start of the project, one of the options was to knock it down and to start again. And we started on a process with them of just trying to get people to connect with its modern architecture and to try and get people to see if they could fall back in love with probably what Alec-French Partnership aspired to achieve back 50 years ago. And this was, back on this slide, you can see here, these are mosaic tiles which were falling off, held on by chicken mesh at the time, or covered by chicken mesh. This was an elevation facing the city where, again, it's got a certain architectural merit if you're into really grunty, brutalist buildings, but the windowsills are too high to enable you to see out from a desk. It doesn't offer you any of the views across Bristol from that elevated position. It's pretty brutalist. And we just adopted five kind of themes to our approach, which are each listed here. So the first one being to try and open up this building to the neighbourhood and to the street. So that thing about dropping windowsills, trying to have a common front door so that everybody could come through at pavement level rather than disabled visitors and others being separated at the first step at the doorstep. Opening up to the pavement. So down here is the access to the swimming pool. This became the front door here, dropping all of the windowsills. And here at the Anson Rooms, which was closed down, thinking hard about solutions for the envelope so that it could be acoustically private, it could still admit fresh air and daylight, but it could have more functions. And in a way, being a bit more like the Georgian buildings elsewhere on the street, of being able to walk past, see what was happening, and celebrate what was happening on the pavement edge. And so here you can just see where we made a simple move of moving the front door from here at the top of these steps to it being right down here on the pavement. So everybody coming in and going to the swimming pool, and everybody coming in and going up, and those coming in could get into a lift and come up and arrive at the same point. So the front door was the same for everybody, and it made a different kind of welcome. The second thing we did, and it's kind of a no-brainer, but it was just to strip the building back to its concrete structure for the sake of creating more headroom. In some rooms, a bit like this, we were able to achieve an extra 2 meters of headroom just removing suspended ceilings which had been put in to hide clutter that was above. What that did was to re-expose the thermal mass of the building to enable it to be used in simple cooling solutions, and it enabled the relationships between the windows and the rooms to be restored, and it just gave a sense of authenticity and realness to the structures. So we wanted to do that on each level. So again, here's the swimming pool down here, going right back up to the structure, the Anson rooms going right back up to the structure, and then elsewhere where we had these concrete downstands and in upper levels, opening up. So we created an atrium at this level so that these landlocked rooms down here in the centre of the plan suddenly had some natural daylight coming into them. Really basic, simple moves, but just reminding people that we could open these spaces up and strip them back. Most of our budget went into, once we dealt with the asbestos removal, most of our budget went into then providing an envelope that was as simple as possible, but as sophisticated as possible at the same time. So really good glazing systems with ventilation systems in them. So hopefully you can see here that, so this is now double glazed, and then within the line of the glazing here, there are, you can just see it in this diagram down here on the bottom left, there are louvered panels. So we're dealing with light and acoustics here, and then enabling air to come in through the elevation so that things start to balance in a more controlled way. And then another thing we try to achieve in our buildings is to try and be as simple as possible about the palette of materials that we use, and therefore be able to afford the best that our clients can afford and minimise the kind of collisions of different materials that happen. And here, where you have concrete everywhere with board markings from how it's cast, we thought a language that brought a warmth of timber into the building would be sensible, to use the natural light, and then to be very simple about signage and graphics and relate that back to the 1960s identity of the original building. So very simple palette of materials, just relating to the architecture and warming spaces up. And then where we found it, this was in the central hub, a kind of foyer space with a series of circles, which circular openings in the floor plan that went up through, just really making sure that that worked as a communal space for everybody at every level. And making the fire escape strategy work so that all of these spaces could stay open and that fresh air and daylight could remain in the centre of the building and remove the signage and clutter from those spaces. And so this is how that building works out, with just bringing those simple ingredients together. So a front door, right on the pavement, welcoming everybody in through the same door. Again, this is, I didn't mention it, but this is a new elevation with more glazing along the pavement side. Again, going back to that slate mosaic that we saw earlier, and using a black brick slip, which is much more affordable, but keeps a consistent palette simply alongside the concrete aesthetic. And back behind, you can see some of these louvered openings sitting in line of the Anson room extensions up there. Inside, being welcomed with a warm, simple interior, pretty functional. And then this is one of the student bars. So again, taking those windowsills down to the floor, just simply enabling people to go from outside to inside on a sunny day. Again, there's more of the black brick slip up here. And then in the student bar area, just having a simple aesthetic, all the services on show, having the concrete as part of the aesthetic, and trying to be consistent in the language of timber bar tops, timber furniture, and just being simple. And then suddenly in the Anson rooms, you find you can use them all day long, and they're delightful spaces to dance in, or they still work as rock concerts, and it's really amazing how people have just started to like each other again around using this building. It's really popular with the students. The neighbours are really happy because they're welcomed into the swimming pool. The university got more than 2,000 square metres of extra floor space out of this project through rationalising its floor plan. So there are lots more teaching spaces, and the students feel that they've been invested in and have got a cool place to work in. And it's just very simple moves to help people fall back in love with very ordinary 1960s buildings, I think. So there's definitely... And these are the hundreds of these buildings for us to have some fun with, and they're full of embodied carbon, and in my view, we can't afford just to knock them down and replace them with, in some cases, less good and less permanent architecture. So turn the clock back a long time, and this is a building that I've been involved with, and it's an invitation to you all to get involved with in some way over the next 3 years. I've been working on this project in Bath for the last 7 years, and it's about to start on site. And I think this is just an amazing thing which is going to happen over the next 3 years as it goes on site and reveals some of its stories and shares some of its stories to our generation. So I'm sure nearly all of you have been to Bath and been to Bath Abbey or the Roman Baths. If you haven't, come and have a look. This is a drawing that a colleague of mine, Matt Somerville, did a couple of years ago. So the Abbey is here, the Roman Baths is next door. I've just shown in red here the line of the old city wall, which is almost invisible now, although the East Gate, which was here, still exists. If you go next to the market and look over the railings, you'll see it. There's still North Gate is here. Westgate Street is called so because it leads down to where the Westgate was. And then, of course, there's the Southgate Shopping Centre, which is outside of the railway station. But I don't know if you can see it on that line, but in blue, just dotted there, is the line of a Roman drain which carries the hot water from the Roman Baths through into the River Avon, which has done that for 2,000 years. And I'll show you some slides of that at the end. But running into the river at 38 degrees Celsius, enough to fill a bath up every 8 seconds, has done for 2,000 years. Nobody knows. There's 6 big carp about that big in the river, just down there. Oh, done there. Just down there. Next time you go to Bath, go into Parade Gardens, look over the railings, and you'll see them there because that's where all this mineral-rich hot water flows into the river. And so the Roman Baths and the Abbey have sat next to each other for nearly 2,000 years in different configurations. And the steaming water of the Roman Baths is part of why Bath is designated as a World Heritage City. It's the only thermal hot spring in the UK, and it's the reason that the Romans settled in Bath, and it's the reason that in the Georgian period, Bath became the 10th biggest city in the UK as everybody came to take the water, try to use its medicinal properties, do a bit of gambling, and Bath was a huge social centre outside of London because of the hot water. Now that's the Roman Baths in the 1840s. And there's quite often a perception that nothing changes in Bath, and it's all a Georgian city, and it's always been like that, or the Roman stuff's always been like it. It's quite remarkable to think in the 1840s, the Roman baths had been completely lost. And it was only through the antiquarian archaeological investigation that happened then and fascinated people, that people went in search of the Roman baths, rediscovered it, re-excavated it, and there you can see the Roman archaeology, and everything above that level is Victorian. So all built just to celebrate the presence of the baths. And so when you go today, you can see this Roman archaeology down here is authentic, and you'll be able to read the difference. But the Abbey is set in the background as a spirit. We think beneath the font in the Abbey is the Roman tholos, which was the spiritual centre of the Roman city. So the site of the Abbey has been the spiritual centre of Bath for 2,000 years, and probably since earlier when people found this mysterious hot bubbling mud, and there's probably a pagan significance to it too. Now the Abbey itself, I'll come on to what we're doing there in a moment, but what you see there is about 500 years old. It was started in 1499. It's been there telling the stories of people's lives lived there, being a centre for faith, and being right in the city centre. Hadn't realised the sound was on, but it sits there as a kind of backdrop to city life in different ways. It sits as a backdrop to 4 very special spaces. This was the old Abbey churchyard. But like most churches, it's a very kind of closed building. And our brief, when we started on this project 7 years ago, was to find ways to open the Abbey up to its visitors, to kind of dissolve the threshold, to make it more welcoming and accessible, to find more space for meetings and to care for people and to look after people, and to provide some toilets. And although the Abbey seats 1,000 people, it had 1 toilet, and so for every performance there'd have to be an interval so everyone could nip over to all bar 1 to use the toilet and make it back for the second half. So making toilets in the project was an important point too. And we've developed a project which is in 2 parts. One which is providing this new space, and the other which is repairing the fabric of the building. In terms of providing new space, on the south side, I'll just click you through some of the ideas which are going to be delivered in the project, which, as I said, starts on site shortly. So the first was looking at the south side of the building, and this extension, which was added in the 1920s, with these blocked windows with obscured glass on a south-facing side, very popular centre of Bath. And we're proposing here to create a new entrance so that 1,000 people can arrive, can be welcomed, can move in and out of the Abbey more easily from a city centre space. And going in through those doors, we found a way to unlock and create new underground space. So this is existing vaulted space at the west end. This is that extension, historic extension that we were looking at just now. But here we're proposing to dig down pretty much to the Roman archaeological level so that we can access this subterranean world of vaults which exist. And so outside the church on this south side, there are a series of new spaces. So the extension we were looking at is here, and this is underground space. So we're talking about coming down to an interpretation space. Incidentally, this is the underground of the Roman baths next door. So for the first time, we're going to create a physical connection between the Abbey space and the Roman baths below ground. And then using these underground pavement vaults and creating a new meeting room underground, and then a new song school, and these very important loos, and the ability to service this big Grade 1 listed building with all of the amenities that it needs in a kind of discrete position. So we've been thinking very hard about a language of materials to provide these connections. Again, a very simple palette here. We're using, again, concrete and bronze and we have to look ahead to try and anticipate archaeologically some of the issues that we're going to expose, but again trying to admit daylight and view. So here at the point that you come in and descend down this new staircase, you'll be able to see up through a roof light right to the top of the Abbey Tower, and then come down into a new interpretation space, new excavation, exposing the side of the Abbey which has been hidden for more than 1,000 years, and coming down to the level of the Roman baths beneath. And then through refitting these existing vaults for places to have a coffee or hear a talk about the building. And then underground at the east end, a new underground meeting room, again with an oculus roof light, so from being 2-3 metres underground you can see right up to the top of the Abbey Tower. So some exciting architectural things that are about to happen outside on site. But I think what's, for me, just as interesting, and as a conservation-minded architect, I think even more exciting, and perhaps more exciting for the future, is what we're doing inside, simply in repairing the fabric of the building. Now this diagram shows in black what you see in Bath today in the architecture of the centre of the city. So that black outline, the cruciform outline there, is the Abbey you see today, which was started in 1499, and it's about 500 years old. In orange is the Norman Cathedral that Bath Abbey was built directly on top of in 1499. So it used the foundations and the piers of that building. And the floor of that building is intact 2 metres below the floor of today's Abbey. So we have a 2 metre sandwich from today's floor down to a 1,000-year-old floor beneath. And you'll see how that was a much larger building, extending out into what's called Orange Grove. And interestingly, that roundabout, if you know it, is a scheduled monument in Bath because it has a Norman apse beneath it. It's never been excavated, but one day it will be, to rediscover and learn about it. And then in orange, over on the left-hand side, or yellow, is the Roman archaeology and the footprint, which is about 4 metres down. Okay, so we've got these layers of history right in the city centre, which are all there, and this water, which is 2,000 years old, flowing from the Roman baths out and down towards the river. And we all wander around oblivious to these amazing layers of history. Now, for me, what's really interesting, and I've been through a court case this year, been cross-examined by lawyers and everything, because we want to make some significant changes inside the building as part of the project. And what the client team would like to do is to think about restoring or going back to a time when the Abbey was like this. This is a painting in the Georgian period, in the west end of the church, and it shows how in the Georgian period you could perambulate in that great west space, you could meet people, and if you were attending a service, you'd sit on seats or you'd sit on a bench at the wall. And it was like that for 300 years, from when it was built in 1500, well, 350 years, through until about 1860. And in 1860, it had a major Victorian overhaul by George Gilbert Scott, one of the most prolific Victorian architects, and he gave the Abbey 150 years ago what we're trying to give it for the next 150 years. So he gave it heating in the floor trenches, he gave it gas lighting, and he gave it the kind of seating that Victorians wanted in their churches by having pews all the way through. And at that stage, churches were paid a grant from the central church according to the number of seats that they could provide. And therefore, many churches were filled right up with pews, and Bath Abbey is a case in point, and its gangways are only 2 feet wide in some instances. It's so full of pews. Love them or hate them. So this was a major part of the Scott reordering. So as well as putting in the floor trenches, you'll see the organ was moved from the middle of the church round into the north, and even the ceiling, which you see here, which was a medieval timber vaulted ceiling, was changed to be a stone fan-vaulted ceiling to copy the 500-year-old ceiling in the east end of the church. So a hugely interventionist scheme which turned it into a Victorian church. So what's really interesting for me is that the Abbey, wanting to create more space for flexible worship, to enable disabled people to sit where they like, to enable performances to face west, not east all the time, to have performances in the round, to invite people to come and have dinner, to go back to that Georgian thing, they have to propose to remove some of the pews. And this is the number of pews in blocks which sit in the Abbey, and they all sit on timber platforms so you can't see the floor beneath your feet. Which is pretty amazing when, beneath those timber platforms, the Abbey is completely paved with carved gravestones, which were covered over in 1860. And this is George Gilbert Scott's drawing of which gravestone went where. So there are 961 carved gravestones relating to 8,500 recorded burials beneath the floor in the building from today's floor level down to the Norman floor level. More than twice as many as in Westminster Abbey. And unlike Westminster Abbey, which tells the story of great lives lived and posh people and, you know, the highest of the high in social structure, it includes in Bath, yes, there's the King's Physician, but there's also the kind of chicken man of Walcott, and 80% of them are from the Georgian period, when Bath was the centre of the social world in the UK, and it's one of the reasons it's been given its World Heritage status. And the black lines on this drawing are Gilbert Scott's floor trenches within which he put radiators. So what we're proposing to do is, firstly, we're going to remove the pews in order to repair the floor, and we've begun a project sponsored by the Heritage Lottery Fund to understand who all of these people were, to whom all of these inscriptions are made, and to find the level of craftsmanship in all of these 960 floor inscriptions, many of which haven't been seen since 1860, so no one alive has seen them since they were covered, and they're all going to be uncovered and lifted and conserved as we repair the holes in the floor left by 8,500 graves, which have gradually settled down. And through the archaeological work we've done, we know that between 10 and 15% of the subfloor in the Abbey is fresh air. So it's like a Swiss cheese in a way, and there's a structural problem that we're addressing, and then we're going to conserve the floor stones and lay them back down. And it will represent what I think will be one of the most important floors in Europe that hasn't been seen for 150 years, and we're the generation that's not only going to uncover it, but we're going to repair it, we're going to relay it, and we're going to teach children about it and invite everyone to come and see and think about what that kind of space means in the centre of a city where we all need a bit of faith and a bit of a reminder about other things in life. So that's a drawing which comes from our survey drawing, and it fills in the gaps beneath the pews based on the Scott record drawing, but we've made it up because obviously the pews get in the way and nobody's seen this view in the major part. Now the last thing the Abbey has as a problem, a bit like Bristol University, is it's got enormous fuel bills because it has a huge medieval building, it has single glazing and a massive space to heat. In the winter, its electricity, or its gas bill has run to thousands of pounds just to try and keep the space warm. And we've done lots of work on this with Bura Happold, who are engineers from Bath. And we've created a three-dimensional thermodynamic model of the Abbey. And what we realised, of course, is that the laws of physics apply. So from these Victorian heating trenches, which are shown here in white, running with hot water at 80 degrees Celsius, convective heat, the heat comes out and it just goes straight up to the roof. And the vaulted stone roof up here is warmer than the ends of the pews that people sit in. And people complain, and then you get a big downdraft of cold coming down from these single glazed windows. And the obvious solution is, rather than having convective heat, which rises, is having radiant heat down at floor level so that it heats the people and the objects rather than the air. And so we've been looking at the possibility of underfloor heating coming in as part of a floor repair and before we lay these gravestones back down on the floor. Which is where we come back to our free heat source next door of hot water running into the river, 35 to 38 degrees C. And what we're proposing to do is, in the Roman drain, employ a heat exchange. Very simple piece of kit to capture the heat, and then, as you do in a fridge, reverse cycle it and take it up to a warmer temperature, and then use it as a primary heat source for the most important historic building in the centre of the city. But still allowing the water to run at a tepid temperature in the Roman drain to make sure that there's no environmental problems. And I'm sure there's a project for the future here, rather like they do with the Diana Memorial in Hyde Park, to tell the story of the way that the only thermal hot spring runs through a city centre into a river in the only way in the country. And that's a visualisation that we've used just to explain, how the architecture of that space and the stories of that space can be uncovered at the end of the project, and fingers crossed, in between 2 and 3 years' time, it'll be the aesthetic that we'll have restored within the building. So that's it. I guess my message is, I'm a slightly nerdy individual in that I'm very interested in historic buildings and conservation and layers of history, and having that inform an approach to, firstly, the design of conservation and being respectful of old buildings and people's stories and craftsmanship and the way we work with them. But what I'm also fascinated to do is to think about how that applies not only to contemporary design but also to the ordinary buildings that we all kick around in. And I'm sure in your careers we'll have lots of opportunity, more than you think probably, to work on and add some architecture too. So I'd like you to feel inspired that there are architecture and design opportunities in all sorts of ways. And if you are interested in conservation and historic buildings, that there are still ways to find exciting careers with exciting practices, and there are many people out there who are seriously interested in your design capability and a way for that to inform understanding and resolving design solutions over the whole spectrum of time. So anyway, I'm here to answer any questions.